Hello, good evening, everyone, and good morning in Australia. Thank you for joining us for this IUAES Congress pre-Congress conversations. Today I have the privilege, and I'm very happy to host a talk about heritage, archaeology, and outer space. And we have two great guests. One is Alice Gorman, and the other one as Ann Johnson. As always, I will introduce them and they will lead our conversation. And just a reminder to those who are listening or viewing us, like you can always ask questions through the chat. That can be Facebook, that can be Twitter, or that can be the chat on YouTube. And we're also transmitting in different channels. Thank you for our colleagues and institutions, the World Council of Anthropological Association, the World Anthropological Union, the Asociación Latinoamericana de Antropología. No, those are giving us the opportunity to, on Facebook, to transmit our live broadcast to reach more people. So I'm going to introduce Dr. Alice Gorman. She's internationally recognized leader in the field of space archaeology. She's a faculty member of the International Space University Southern Hemisphere Space Program in Adelaide. I hope I pronounced it correctly. She has worked extensively in Indigenous heritage management, providing advice for mining industry, urban development, government departments, local councils, and native titles groups in NSW, WA, SA, and Queensland. Alice is a member of the Advisory Council of the Space Industry Association of Australia, a member of the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, and president of the Anthropological Society of South Australia. She, of course, you can follow her. She tweets as Dr. Space Junk on Twitter, and actually it's a pleasure to follow her. She's always sharing information. And now I'm also have the pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Ann Johnson. That, by the way, she's also my neighbor here in Mexico City, where we are. Now, she is a professor in the graduate program of social anthropology at the Universidad Iberoamericana in Mexico City. She has undertaken extensive research in Mexico on collective memory, performance, and art practice, and material culture in the state of Guerrero. Her current project, based on ethnographical research at the Mexican Space Agency, university scientific laboratories, and artistic collectives, revolves around Mexican imaginaries of outer space and the future. She is particularly interested in the ways in which anthropologists of outer space can establish productive dialogues with collaborators in the field of science, technology, and art. Thank you both for joining us. So I'm going to start with a very, probably naive question, because probably, I don't know, some of the people who are watching or viewing us, doesn't know or understand what it is about heritage in outer space. For example, Alice, we were talking, minutes before the broadcast, and I mentioned, Alice, that, for example, Anne and I, we have had this conversation probably a couple of years from now about trying, for me at least, trying to understand what it is about outer space and now how, or what does anthropologists have to do with our, anthropologists, archaeologists, artists. They are imagining, studying, performing, doing a lot of things. So please, if you can start sharing, your ideas, this is the floor. Of course, as I also want to remind everyone that this is an open space, so please join in with your questions and we will be happy to answer them the best way we can. Well, but they can, because I'm not the expert here. Thank you very much. Please, this is how can we start.
Well, can I say thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this conversation with Anne. And I think it's so interesting that we've got different aspects of material culture and imagination coming together with this. But before addressing your question, Ricardo, I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from the land of the Eora people, of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation here in Sydney, actually. I'm not in Adelaide just at the moment. I acknowledge their elders, past and present, and the connections they have to their traditional country and the importance that their cultural heritage has to them in the past and in today. And I extend my respect to the traditional owners of all of the countries that our listeners are joining us from today as well. And I guess that's actually an interesting way to have an entree into like why we're even talking about outer space in this context, because particularly with archaeology, people tend to assume that it's about the past and it's about the deep past. It's about thousands of years ago, tens of thousands of years ago, millions of years ago. So how can something that's so recent in our memory be archaeology? And of course, the straight answer to that is that archaeology actually isn't about old things, although a lot of the time it is. Archaeology is about material things and what humans do with those material things. So that means you can do it in any time and any place, and that place can be outside the Earth. And I would argue even that we're just in the last few years alone, we have seen an acceleration of interest in space, particularly using the resources available on the Moon, Mars, asteroids, and particularly the resources of Earth orbit. And I'm even using that word, resources. So that's something, you know, we can talk about as well. Everybody is planning missions to the moon. It looks like we are going to have mining off Earth happening very soon. So these aren't questions that disciplines outside aerospace engineering can ignore anymore. We actually have to engage with this. And for me, looking at the material culture of space, looking at satellites as artifacts or a planetary landing site like Apollo 11 as an archaeological site that tells us something about human behaviour that we can't get from the documentary or the oral record is actually an important part of trying to understand what's happening right now and what we might need to know about it. And for me, as an Australian who comes from a background of working in Indigenous heritage management, something I see over and over is that Indigenous people are left out of these conversations. They don't get a seat at the table. They don't get an opinion about what's happening. And yet they often have very ancient and ongoing relationships with particular parts of space. And there's a saying that you see a bit in the space world, and it's, you know, people say from the space age to the Stone Age, or, you know, we've left the Stone Age behind and now we're in the space age, as if Indigenous people live in the past and have been superseded or even erased by the advent of the space age. And this, you know, it's a convenient framing of it, and it's very archaeological in the sense that you have successive ages. You start with the Stone Age, you go to the Bronze Age, the Copper Age, the Iron Age, the Industrial Age, now we're in the Space Age. But that kind of linear, progressive, evolutionary perspective, it's so 19th century, it's so social Darwinist. So as we're entering into this new phase of space activity, I think it's even more critical than it has ever been to be interrogating these really easy narratives that just come to our lips, and making sure that when we talk about space being for all humanity, we actually mean that. Like we actually mean all humanity, not just wealthy so-called spacefaring nations. So for me, looking at the objects, the artifacts of our engagement with outer space is actually something that's really critical to understanding, well, maybe as Anne would say, the imaginaries that we have built around this very particular activity, and understanding who is part of the story, who is not part of the story, and how those objects speak to different groups of people, different individuals, different classes, different nationalities, ethnicities, whatever it is, trying to understand the multiplicity and multivalency of the stories that exist around space, which are not just about Cold War US, USSR stuff, and are not just about the European Space Agency and NASA and a few of the other wealthy ones. They're actually about everybody And I see archaeology as a strand of interrogating and understanding what this all means. So that was a longish answer to a relatively straightforward question, Ricardo, but I hope kind of sets some context for the way I'm thinking about these things.
Oh, thank you. Oh, it's great. Anne, what do you have to say?
No, I'm completely inspired, first of all, by the work of Alice. Alice has a great book that everybody in the world should read called Dr. Space Junk versus the Universe. And I've been very inspired by this book because it talks about this idea of what stuff is in space. And this is, I think this is a first question that we need to ask, because maybe not everybody's aware of how much human stuff is actually in space, what those things are, and what things are considered valuable and what things are not. And I think that has to do with this idea of heritage as well. What objects are considered to be significant and why, and what other kinds of objects. And we think about most of these sort of stuff in space has been sort of cataloged as space junk. And I think Alice can talk more about that. Like what thousands and thousands and thousands of little bits of industrial culture that are in space. But what of those objects are considered valuable? And that's, I think, looking from Australia and looking from Mexico, I think is particularly interesting because most of the sort of valuable, or what's considered to be these valuable objects or valuable sites, do have to do with these first world countries and their sort of process of space exploration, right? So if you think about it for Mexico, what's Mexican about space? And a lot of people would say, well, nothing. No, or maybe there would be some appeal to sort of pre-Hispanic cosmovision, right? And or sites on Earth that are considered heritage. And I think that places like Chichen Itza, in Yucatan, where there is an edifice that's actually called the observatory and is considered to be a place where ancient peoples would look to the stars. So that's the kind of thing that I think in Mexico people would say, oh, sure, we have this like long tradition of stargazing, and that's part of our heritage. That's part of cultural heritage. But if we think about industrial material culture in Mexico, it's maybe a little bit more complicated. That said, there are Mexican things in space. And I think to think about what those things are and what of those things are valuable is really interesting. One of the ways that we think about what's valuable is like, what was first, right? Like, what was the first satellite in space and where is that now? The first Mexican satellite in space. And we can actually debate what is Mexican about this satellite that wasn't made in Mexico, but was launched as a Mexican initiative for Mexican telecommunications in 1985 is the Morelos system, which people here will know about, but nobody knows where it is. It lived its useful satellite life and then is now considered unlocalizable space trash. Should we consider things like that space heritage, Mexican heritage in space? So, and I think satellites are a really interesting example of that, especially because there's so much interest now in Mexico and a lot of other countries, smaller countries that have sort of nascent space programs, which is the case of Mexico, and not these giant telecommunications satellites that are going to occupy geostationary orbit, but CanSats and CubeSats and these little sort of miniaturized technological satellites that now are being considered as sort of part of this imaginary of how sort of non-traditional space race countries can participate and have a presence in space. So I think satellites are really interesting in that way. And how they're named, the place names and satellite names. And this is a whole other thing that Alice talks a lot about, of place names. And we can talk about this later, but I was completely inspired to like go through the list and see what Mexican places exist in space.
So tell me, I'd love to know what you found as a result of your survey, because it's, so you went to the International Astronomical Union Gazetteer it is huge. There are thousands of place names. So what did you find? How much of Mexico is represented in the rest of the solar system?
Venus is actually very Mexican, it turns out. I did not do an exhaustive search, and I'm probably leaving things out because it's, like you say, it's a huge list, and it's really there. You can tell us how many place names exist in our solar system, but I found in a sort of first run through about 72 Mexican names in the solar system. some on Venus, which, and as you know, and most people probably don't know, but each sort of planet and each cosmic body has there are different rules for what kinds of names can be used for those places. So Venus is usually the names are artists and sort of creative types, right? So there's a bunch of Mexican, Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo have place names on Venus, and there are also a lot of indigenous names in our solar system. Various Mayan goddesses of love and all that sort of thing on Venus, as well as other places. And this list is growing because of the explorations, the rover explorations on Mars. There was a Mexican astrobiologist who was involved in that and on that team, and he died this year, and so he now has a hill named after him on Mars. So they're growing all the time, but I found about 70 some odd names in our solar system, and a lot of them are indigenous, not named by indigenous people, but named by non-indigenous Mexicans using indigenous names, which is I think is an interesting topic itself. But yeah, I'd love to hear if you're doing any more on that and how you came to think about that yourself.
Yeah, I mean, the naming process is it's like writing solar system landscapes with a kind of a colonial kind of narrative, because there's the old story of some European arrives in a global south country and starts naming features. They claim the land and they start naming features. And I'm currently in the state of New South Wales, which is named after the region of Wales in the UK. So, absolutely no connection there to who was living there before and how that happened. So we kind of carried this process into the rest of the solar system. And my Australian colleague Katerina Damjanov calls this it's a process of cultural terraforming. We're recreating these landscapes with names that have resonance for us, that enable us to kind of have a point of connection to understanding. So I did a survey of the International Astronomical Union's Gazetteer of Place Names as well, to locate Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander names. It turns out there's 0.03% of all of the places in the solar system. So here we're talking about, the names craters on a planet get, or particular geographical features get. But this is interesting to me because that process of naming creates a connection with the Indigenous community those names come from, and there may actually be rights and responsibilities associated with that, which those communities didn't ask for, but may now have. And there may actually be implications. So one of the hot topics at the moment is property rights in space. So what if the fact that a crater on Pluto is named for an important ceremonial figure from the Northern Territory, from ceremonies that are still performed today, what if that actually gives that particular group some rights in that place? Okay, no one's going to Pluto anytime soon. So this is a discussion at the moment which maybe has no implications, but there are place names much closer to Earth. So if someone's, if we're going to rewrite the treaties, which I hope doesn't happen, because I think the Outer Space Treaty and the Moon Agreement of 1979 are actually incredibly important documents we need to be holding fast to. But if we move away from that, Western legal framing of who can do what in space, we have to start to open up discussions about other ways of having rights. I suppose it is rights in space that other people have that are outside of that legal system. So what does that mean, and how do people deal with that? So this is, as far as I know, a conversation that's not really been had yet. But I think it's also interesting because in both of these, the process of giving names to things in outer space is part of that imagining what these places are and what they mean. That it draws these places into an imaginary that is about how we conceive of these other worlds and other spaces, which I think, Anne, is something you have many more thoughts about as well.
Well, I think, I think I find it really interesting to think about who in Mexico is involved in the space industry, and it's it's generally urban, younger people. There are not, as far as I can tell so far, there's not a lot of sort of indigenous participation in space technology and the development of space technology. There are some projects that have to do with the use of GPS for like territory defense projects that are based on indigenous territories. But yeah, so the people who are sort of doing this tend to emulate in some way the sort of practices and discourses that they've inherited from experiences with NASA and experiences with the European Space Agency. And there's a lot of talk about innovation, and there's a lot of talk about exactly the sort of exploitation of resources. Mining is fascinating, and I'd love to hear what you think about that. I think in Australia mining has a long history. In Mexico, mining has a very long history, very much tied to imperialism and very much tied to colonialism. The money that came out in Mexico financed all kinds of things in Europe, and now there is talk of how Mexico could, as a country that is an expert in mining, could participate in the mining of asteroids, for example. This is very nascent. This is not something that's a huge deal yet, but there is some talk, even in the Mexican Mining Association, is sort of starting to talk about that. And so this sort of replication of these colonial processes, which on the one hand, a lot of people in Mexico criticize and are very much like, oh, the conquest of Mexico was genocide and it caused this national trauma. At the same time, as these same people are saying, and now we're gonna do a Mexican conquest of space. So there's a sort of really sort of interesting and problematic ways of speaking about this process that I think really need to be examined a little bit more profoundly.
I think that's so interesting. This year, as people may have picked up, the 12th of April 2021 was the 60th anniversary of Yuri Gagarin's famous first space flight. Coming back to that idea of firsts again, Anne, as being one way that these narratives about what's important are constructed. But so Yuri Gagarin was the first person to go outside the Earth and come back and survive. And after he did that, he went on a world tour. And one of the major purposes of this world tour was to sway the hearts and minds of unaligned nations. And many of those unaligned nations were in South America. And he actually visited Brazil. I don't know if he came to Mexico. He did come to Mexico. But so back then in 1961, there was this very strong dialogue that was being played out, in the national newspapers of many countries. That, interestingly to me, was highly critical of the Cold War superpowers, and also because Australia, of course, was always on the side of the US. So we've been in the US's pocket for a long time. So that level of debate didn't happen in Australia, but it did happen in Mexico and Brazil and Chile and Peru. All of these nations at the time were talking about what are the implications of this, and particularly what are the implications for future peace and war. So that's kind of my small entree into some of the early history of how people were imagining space. So it's really, and of course you have, as you say, you have this these mining colonial mining enterprises, and you have colonial mining landscapes across many countries. I think Argentina has tin and silver, and there's one, I can't remember where, but there's a tri-national World Heritage Listing nomination that's been in the works for many years about tin mining that crosses several countries. So there's all of that heritage kind of going on as well. So suddenly to open this kind of dialogue again with, okay, let's go and mine other planets or moons or asteroids. And Australia's in the same position as well. We're saying, hey, we're the experts in remote area automated mining. We can do this. And this to me is slightly, apologies to my Australian mining colleagues, but this is slightly even amusing, because nobody talks about, particularly on the moon, the issues of lunar dust, which is basically, you know, you can make all the fancy automated machinery that you like, but the minute you put it on that lunar surface, it is going to get clogged up with lunar dust, which is highly abrasive, highly adhesive. It sticks to everything. And that is a real problem that will have to be overcome. But you don't often see this being raised as an issue when you read news stories about how all of this terrestrial technology will be, you know, easily transplanted into another off-Earth setting. So I do find that's interesting. But I think this raises another really interesting issue. So on Earth now, for decades, we've had an environmental management process that most countries have some legislation around this. Most mining operations have to go through a series of environmental approvals in order to go ahead, and generally they have to agree to rehabilitation or remediation procedures at the end of the mine's life. So in space, the mining community, and I should add that my experience is that there's very little overlap between the space mining community and the terrestrial mining community. I mean, some of it comes together with the discussion of mining expertise that might be transferable, whether it's skills or technology, but generally these are separate groups of people. But the space mining people would say, there are no living ecologies on the moon, on an asteroid, therefore rehabilitation is just, don't need it, don't have to do it. And I think there's an environmental aspect to this. So, and there's a sort of cultural heritage aspect to this as well. The environmental aspect is that the treaties forbid harm to other planetary environments, and harm has not been defined, but it would not be hard to do. And in my desires for this kind of process, I would say that, you know, on Earth you have an open cut mine, you have to remove the soil and layers, you have to retain the topsoil, you have to have seeds so that you can return the original mix of vegetation to that place. You have to try and make the mine look as if the mine had never happened. And of course, that's quite hard to do. And the mine is there, you know, the open cut is there, or the underground columns are still there, you know. But you can do the same on another planet or on an asteroid to restore the landscape to its prior aesthetic values and the prior conditions in which that landscape interacted with the rest of the cosmos. So people say the moon is dead. Well, I argue strongly against that. The moon is participating in interplanetary and cosmic processes all the time. And one of those processes is bombardment by cosmic rays and micrometeorites. So you could restore a mining surface to enable that process, which is part of the moon's existence, to continue. So it's an environmental aspect to this. And so I think rehabilitation is something we need to really seriously consider for these off-world landscapes. But there is a view, coming back to you know, Anne mentioned the characterization of things as junk before. So there is a very strong view, of which, of course, I have sympathies with, that let's hypothetically say we have a mine on the moon or an asteroid, that we are damaging the environment, we will be leaving behind equipment, tailings, all kinds of things. And these are all bad and should all be erased as if they never happened. From a heritage perspective, I would say, well, sure, but we can't pretend it never happened. And the impacts on the landscape, however disguised, are still there and still happened and still disrupted processes. So we shouldn't try and hide it. We should actually highlight I'm not saying don't do anything, but I'm saying it's important to recognize that this is a cultural landscape. All of these, you don't privilege one type of human activity over another and say, you know, here is our idealized moment in time, and we shall fixate everything on that moment of time, because 100 years from now, that mining landscape on the moon may have the same cultural significance as early mining landscapes on Earth do, as evidence of colonial processes, for example, of the particular technological ideas of the time. So they become heritage in themselves in a certain way. They also become incorporated into that landscape. And I think it would not be the right move to take to try and pretend that never happened. So we have a balance to strike there. And this is something we can actually do work on right now. I've had some interesting discussions with people in the space community recently in which they say, look, we'll figure this stuff out once stuff has started happening on the surface. So then we'll know more and we can say, okay, here are some of the directions to go. And my opinion is no, once we're on the surface disrupting things, it's too late. It's too late to figure this stuff out. We have to have it all done beforehand. We didn't have that opportunity for terrestrial industry. We do have it now. And a key part of that is, you know, getting a dialogue between all these different sectors going. And it's interesting, actually, because when, you know, sometimes I talk about space archaeology and heritage to space mining engineers and aerospace engineers. And you know, there can be a degree of skepticism, I guess. But there's often a point of connection when I sort of say, well, this is your heritage. These technologies are actually, you know, these are the things you have worked on. These are your projects. I'm interested in your connection to them and how they make you feel. And sometimes it's the first time anyone has ever asked an aerospace engineer what their emotional response is to this stuff that they've worked on. And they often have incredibly interesting things to say. So I don't think we should just say it's trash, it's bad. I think we need a much more nuanced approach to this. And I'm obviously not advocating for let's just go and do it without any consideration for these other issues or values, as I've just explained. But I guess I'm also not a fan of the idea that we say any kind of human interaction is automatically bad and to be decried. I just think we need something richer than that.
Thank you, Alice. I'm just going to interrupt a little bit because we have some comments and greetings. Ron Mader?
Ron!
Run!
No, actually, he's writing both. Viva Space Archaeology. Yes, we like it, of course. We have Jeff Spakowski. No.
He's another lovely Twitter friend.
And we have Paula Liu Rush, that she actually is in Michoacan. And yes. So, and Hannah Malandra, well, she's on Twitter. She has a question. It's like, do you think fireworks will be part of the imaginaries that relate to space? Imitation from outer space, you know, kind of like seeing in our closer sky. And And also she has this, like, I do think how space is not really present as a heritage for many modern societies, a loss for all. So, well, those are two comments. And I wanted to do just one, or an addition to this, of what Alice was saying. I'm sorry, I'm a fan of certain comics. But for example, Alice that was mentioning right now, like all the tools and technology left behind in some asteroids, for example. There's a great example in one of the issues of Superman and Batman, you know, when they are, when, you know, they're trying to figure out where all the kryptonite, you know, being mined. And they actually find some of the tools, you know, like the drills from LexCorp in some of these asteroids, God knows where. Now, so there's one of the examples because they left one of the drills, and that's how they figure out who they should ask. You know, like there's a joke of saying, like, you know, alien, how do they put it? Alien technologies don't use serial numbers for technology or something like that. So it's kind of like very brief and something, you know, very interesting. So, well, that's my very few comments. And please, you know, like questions. Oh, here he goes. Hannah Malandra has another question, comment. Environmental activists are claiming darkness to recover space beyond luminic pollution. Well, I don't know about that. Okay, well, we can think about it. But just... I just want to go a very quick step backwards, because I think that, well, that, for example, like one thing before going, for example, understanding, for example, rights in our space or heritage in our space, there are a couple of works, research, and I was trying to remember the first name, but actually I remember his last name, Redfield. No, he's the guy who wrote about...
Peter Redfield.
Exactly. So, for example, it's thinking first, and I learned that, for example, from my history of science courses with Naomi Oriskis, not that we were discussing, like, it is not that, you know, certain countries are going to space, but space industry is like actually, you know, having impact in their own communities. And actually, I think that's what Alice has done work with. And actually, that's very, I think that it's a very direct link with, for example, how we think about, for example, land appropriation, cultural landscapes in Mexico. You know, like this kind of construction. You know, and you know, you connect it at some point. Like I would mention, and once this very weird idea. Well, it's not an idea from me. It's something that I found in a museum. That it's a cardboard model of those satellites that Anne was mentioning. You know, like, it's the weird thing, like, for kids to imagine, they have cardboard. It's kind of an idea of how all these Mexican, and I'm going to underline that, Mexican satellites are, you know, roaming or flying around. So there's two comments there, and of course the ideas from our friends online. So please just keep it going. If I know there's many things to talk about, and imaginaries, heritage rights. Naming.
I want to leap in here, which is kind of going off track, but thinking about some things that Anne was saying, because there's this very strong narrative that activities in space should be for the benefit of all humanity, and that's in the main treaties, and, you know, the US Artemis Accords are reinforcing that idea, but that's contrasted or counterbalanced by the fact that access to space tends to be controlled by the very wealthy, you know, Western industrial, capitalist and former communist countries. So you have these two things, space for all humanity, and yet only a few people can get to space. If you base your definition of spacefaring around launch capability, because not everybody, and I learned from Anne that Mexico launched its first rocket in 1957. So I think that that you know, there's the dominance of the US and NASA in sort of laying claim to space. And recently, people might remember a couple of years ago, the film First Man, that was about the life of Neil Armstrong, was released. And They show landing on the moon, but they don't show the moment of the planting of the US flag. And people in the US just went bunter about this, like that made lots of people very, very angry. And people were saying, but these missions were 100% US. Well, really? Are you really sure about that? Because the US relied on the cooperation of numerous nations. And Mexico had a tracking station that was used for the Mercury and Gemini missions. So did Australia. So did numerous other countries. If you look at that Apollo 11 landing site, there's a Swiss-designed experiment to measure cosmic dust. There's an Australian-designed experiment to measure lunar dust. If you looked at where all the different parts of those components were manufactured, you would find things that came from a whole range of different countries and places. So at a certain level, almost every major space mission has the involvement of a whole range of different nations, but we don't tell those stories and people don't know about them. And this is where I think heritage is critical, because we have that kind of national story about, let's look at the things Mexico did with its early rocket launches, the tracking stations, that history of, Indigenous astronomy as well, telecommunication satellites in the 1980s. It's a bit similar to Australia in that regard as well. So we did the same with our telecommunication satellite. We bought them off the shelf from Boeing, I think. They were launched by the US, but they're still Australian. We're legally the launching state. And Indonesia launched its first telecommunication satellite in 1976. So if you go to every country, you will find it has space heritage. Nigeria had a 1956 tracking station. So, and it also tracked Gemini and Apollo. So heritage becomes critical in saying, we were there too. This isn't 100% US, USSR, Russia, European Space Agency. We were all there too. And if it comes in the future, and we see sometimes this happens on Earth, if someone attempts to claim territory in space in contravention of the Outer Space Treaty, an argument that has been made on Earth that could happen in space is, well, where is the evidence that you have ever used this part of space? All of the material culture, all of the objects, all of the left here are from, let's say, hypothetically, the US. So it's important to be able to make that counter-argument by recognizing the space heritage of other nations and the degree to which these missions, touted as being on behalf of all humanity, were and weren't at the same time, were and weren't, but they were. So I think space heritage becomes, on Earth and in space, becomes a really important part of saying, yes, this really is for the benefit of all humankind. And your perception that it's 100% this particular nation is incorrect. And here is the physical evidence. So some of this trash in space is actually evidence that in that scenario, that country has the right to be there because it is historically being present. And okay, that's a colonialist argument too, I get that. But I also think it's a tool that can be used in the event, which I think is going to happen, that one nation makes a territorial claim and then it's going to be a free-for-all. Once that symmetry is broken, our friends, the space billionaires, are going to be happy people, happy men.
Happy men, exactly. And I think that's part of the concerns that a lot of people have, is that it's no longer just nations either. Now it's these private companies, and how do they fit into to these treaties? They didn't sign these treaties, but their companies are of course incorporated in national territories. So how does the law apply or not apply to them and to their activities? I think is a whole discussion. And yeah, the planting of the American flag on the moon, based on what were really very hard work of countries all around the world. And I understand that there was a discussion about whether the flag was going to be the United Nations flag. Obviously, that did not happen, unfortunately. But I think that's very interesting. And there's a meme that goes around here in Mexico that's like that famous picture of planting the flag on the moon, but it's the Mexican flag instead of airbrushed in the Mexican flag. So yeah, I don't know. That then this whole I think part of what the comments on YouTube or Facebook about. I kind of got lost in the idea of fireworks, but I think part of the question about like the sky, for example, the sky as part of sort of human heritage, and if a dark sky is part of our heritage and how we can protect a dark sky, which allows for sort of seeing outside our own atmosphere and our own bubble, and what happens when that sky is no longer dark because there's a linked satielites are just covering the sky. What that means for astronomy, but what that just means for people looking up, and I keep thinking about a comment that I heard from my students did some interviews and there's a metro station in Mexico City called Metro La Raza, and that metro station is a giant sort of indoor museum that has what's called the sky vault. So it's like a planetarium underground. It's very cool. So just people going to work every day, on the subway, walk through sort of a space landscape. And my students did some interviews with them, and then I remember sort of very specifically one guy who had grown up in a rural area in Puebla and now lives in Mexico City was like, yeah, God, I miss the sky, because in Mexico City you can't see anything because there's so much light. So I just miss seeing the stars at night. And so this is the only place I can come to see stars, and it's in a metro station underground. It's really sort of poignant, I guess. But yeah, like what part of space is part of our heritage, just in a sort of everyday way? And I think the sky has to do with that. And this whole thing about where space begins, it is at the Kármán line, which is 100 kilometers, I guess, above the surface of the Earth. There's a project, a sort of technoscience project in the state of Hidalgo in Mexico, where they're building a sort of space center, but the activity is going to be stratospheric balloons. So they're not actually going into orbit, but there's sort of this idea that there's a sort of not quite Earth, but not quite space that's going to be sort of occupied with sort of Mexican space activities. I don't know. I think it's all fascinating.
I think the fireworks are interesting. Sorry to go back to that question, because of course, in the deep history of rockets, the Chinese invention of gunpowder, and then fireworks, and then the rockets that kind of had a little military trajectory that went to China, India, UK, US. So that's really interesting if you look at the origins of rocket science in China. But I love fireworks. I know they're environmentally unsound and expensive and things, but I love them. And I think that does kind of relate to, they're like in the middle distance. So they like make the volume of space around you, that they make it visible in the same way that kind of, for me, the first time I saw snow ever, what really struck me was that you could, the flakes of snow made you see the volume of space that you were walking in a way you'd never seen it before. And I think fireworks kind of, they're like bringing the stars closer to us so we can see them better. And there is something, again, about, like boundaries, as Anne was saying, like where space, Australia is one of the few countries in the world that has legislated that space begins at 100 kilometres, because it's incredibly hard to define. And of course, the key thing here is that aviation law applies below 100 kilometres and space law applies above. So there's kind of, it's not just about, being pedantic about where space begins, but I think fireworks are like, they're a spectacle. They're, something that comes from times in the past when such things were incredibly rare. you know, incredibly special experiences. And I think they've got that technological lineage, and I think, yeah, they're just also interesting in that we're focusing. I mean, now, you know, you have city lights and you can see aeroplane lights, fireworks sort of take place in that middle distance. Now we have the mega constellations. We have Starlink. That's sort of close. They're the most visible satellites, it would seem. People can see them easily. So visually, we're kind of, and tell me what you think, we're sort of colonizing these different levels of space visually by what we can see and what people are putting there for us to see. Fireworks are a temporary event. Starlink is forever, to use a terrible metaphor.
Starlink is forever. That's depressing. Yeah, I absolutely, and it makes me think sort of the history of like balloons too. Like, I mean, the hot air balloons, right? Yeah, that were like those sort of first way of looking down on the Earth from above, which wasn't as above as you can get now. Obviously, you know, it's not Google Earth, but at the same time, the sort of middle space that like allows for turning the gaze back down onto Earth as well.
And, you know, I think so. I don't know if this was the case in Mexico, but in Australia in the 1960s, in children's playgrounds, they built rockets, playground rockets that kids could climb up. And they're like beloved objects that parents remember, and the ones that survive, they take their kids back to play in the rocket. And I think it's the same thing. It's like the little kid climbs up 30 meters and has that view of Earth, but at a scale appropriate to their body. And I think there's something about that makes these playground rockets like so deep a part of people's childhood memories.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think, you know, this is something that there's an anthropologist called Valerie Olson who works with this, the idea of like, of atmosphere, like how are we extending the idea of our environment further and further up, right? And how sort of Earth's system gets expanded by this sort of occupation space, which I think is just really fascinating and important. And how satellites, I think satellites specifically, play an important part in that. You know, how I have an artist friend who's like, yeah, we're already in space. It's like, Earth is already in space. We don't have to go to space because we're already there. And I mean, technically that's true. Of course, we are in space. But somehow it's different. The imaginary of us being in space is different when you start putting human things further and further away from the surface of the Earth, you know?
Yeah, and the furthest thing that we've put out there is, you know, the Voyager 1 and 2 space probes. And to me, I mean, again, coming back to the idea of material culture and its heritage value, for me, that makes the entire solar system and beyond a cultural landscape that we have imbued with values. And, you know, I think something we often, you know, people have strong feelings about those Starlink satellites. Mine are probably already evident. But, you know, not everybody, lots of people think they're amazing. They love the technology. They love going outside to look at them. So people have emotional connections to these spacecraft and space objects as well. And I often think about what it will be like when we're no longer receiving signals from Voyager 1 and 2. That's going to be, I can't remember the exact predicted date. They keep finding clever ways to extend the amount of power left to the spacecraft, but it's in the next few years. They will fall silent. And we'll know they're out there, but we won't hear them anymore. And to me, that will feel like
a loss.
Losing sense, an absolute loss. When Voyager 2's Twitter account went offline in the US shutdown of 2016 or something, there was a US government shutdown and Voyager 2 went offline, and I woke up in the morning and I couldn't see its Twitter feed and I cried. Like, I was so upset. That was just the Twitter. It wasn't even the real spacecraft. So I think those emotional connections are a really important part. And the visibility of these things is, you know, it helps us make connections as well. So I'm going to expect, I'm not going to try and you know, impose my feelings about Starlink on anyone else, but I suspect with Starlink, with the other mega constellations currently being launched, people are going to have complex feelings that will emerge in different ways that we can't even predict over the coming decade. And I think for, me as an archaeologist and you as an anthropologist, Anne and Ricardo, that's something that's going to be really interesting to track. That's a really rich territory of investigating the human engagement with space.
Well, it's already happening. And remember, when was this? When we have this the Mars rover, when they, remember that there was even a cartoon, and it was actually very sad because we were following on Twitter, what was going on, and that they say like actually it didn't say it, but like the cartoon or the drawing was saying like everything's going very dark, and of course you feel a hole in your stomach.
It was awful. It was horrible.
No, and it's part of the feelings and the imaginaries.
Yeah.
No.
Yes.
This making of the rovers and robots into sort of anthropomorphized beings, and they are beings in a way. Yeah, and it's. I mean, I read a lot about it. The teams that worked on those rovers, of course, had a very strong emotional attachment. But it's not just the people who had contact; it's all of us who are imagining these little Wallies, right, on Mars or whatever.
And it's funny, we imagine them as little because we see pictures of them often without a scale, but they're big. they're quite impressive. But we have the sort of the what's the word I want, like miniaturize, our visual miniaturization of them as like a little puppy dog or something is an important
part of our bodies.
How we make yes exactly. And like a lot of aerospace engineers I've talked to, it's sort of like they get annoyed. They're like, they're machines, they're robots, they're technology. They're not things to have fluffy, warm feelings about. Well, I don't care. I like feeling this way about these little objects.
They're fluffy feelings. I don't know. Yeah, but
and of course, all that serves to for people to support politically investment in these projects as well, right? I mean, if we didn't, I think there's the fact that Voyager would have a Twitter account and that we could follow and care about Voyager makes it much more likely for politicians in our countries to vote to continue investing, in these projects. I mean, there is a sort of cynical aspect to it as well, right?
Yes, you are right, and I think we can be cynical about, and we should be cynical about this. But I think it's also it also kind of demonstrates, I think, that. There's a model for terrestrial industry, particularly mining, that's increasingly being used, which is called the social license to operate. And the idea is that, a mining company isn't going to be obliged by law to do all the right things. They're going to do the right things because the public will demand it and because they want to have public support. So if we extend that concept, beyond even lunar mines to a lot of space industry, then yes, they ought to be seeking ways to engage with the general public and to get public support, and they need to also accept when the public does not support these projects. So yeah, I think it's a bit of a double-edged sword in some ways, but I also think it's quite a good way, so long as the public knows about it, so long as the public actually is given the opportunity to participate, which is a whole other question, I guess. But yeah, I think there's in terms of public support for space activity, this appealing to the emotions is a critical aspect of that.
Yeah, but yes. I was going to say like the emotion, because I was thinking, for example, now that you were talking about the Voyagers, I really like this, how can I say, documentary made by Penny Lane, that is called The Voyagers. It's like 15 minutes. No, I recommend it.
I haven't seen it. Yeah.
Great music. It talks about the project, Carl Sagan, and it has an intertwined history of love and some comments. And actually, it makes you think. I put it to my students, and they were like, wow, this is different. This is like, yeah, this is like the kind of things like, science is not something that it's like unemotional or emotionless, like there's a lot of things involved, and it's not only about math or physics or chemistry, but it's also a lot about, social sciences and humanities involved, trying to understand our interaction with a lot of this technology. I was gonna make a comment. Laura Lee Roche actually made a comment that Metro La Raza. I'm sorry to make this comment a little late. That she mentions that Metro La Raza is a place with where no two clocks show the same time, and I agree. It's a very weird place. And back in the day, in Metro La Raza, when let's not do a lot of numbers, but 25 years ago, there was this kind of scale, universe scale, in one of the sides of the wall where you walk and you say like, this is, Earth, you're standing here, and with pictures, they start moving in that 1 kilometer walking, to reach out to certain places. I don't remember which was the place, but it was 20 years ago, so probably it was Alpha Centauri or something like that. So it's a very weird and very interesting place. I don't know if they have updated the ceiling, I don't know.
I'm not sure. I know they've done some work. I don't know if the ceiling itself has been changed, but they have sort of rotating exhibits.
And probably Google Maps have something, like a Google View or something. But anyway, we've got to figure that out.
I'm very intrigued.
Well, we're going to invite Alice to Mexico, and our first stop will be Metro La Raza.
I was hoping, that our first stop will be some nice tacos, but...
Okay, tacos.
No, tacos first, then Metro La Raza.
Oh, yes. Okay. And we have another comment from Saibot. This is from Facebook. And he said, greetings from, I'm going to translate. Greetings from Chihuahua. I would like to ask, and we already actually mentioned this, about the satellites orbiting around Earth. Can they still communicate? And I think, yes, some of them still are working. And as Anne mentioned, some are just there.
Dead. Entre
comillas.
Entre comillas, exactly.
No, that we don't know if we can communicate because it depends on two different interfaces. One at Earth, and we don't know if that technology is working, and might know that, and we don't know if they're transmitting, or probably they're transmitting, and there's no way here in Mexico we can hear them. And this goes with the same question in what are the implications of the interaction of these pieces of technology without human agency?
Oh, what an interesting way of putting it. What do you think, Anne?
I was going to ask you exactly that same question.
I think that talking about agency actually brings a new dimension to the consideration of, so yes, it's
I know I read recently, and I can't remember if you were talking about this or if I read this from someone else, but there's the majority of sort of satellites and pieces of satellites that are in the solar system right now no longer work. Certainly a lot of them do, but there's a lot of sort of non-functional technology in space. But I remember reading that there are some of that technology doesn't work, not because it's broken per se, but because whatever the code has been lost, or there's just, for some weird reason, there's no way to get in touch with those satellites. But there are people, sort of just people, not necessarily governments and not necessarily companies, but just people who are looking for ways to kind of recuperate contact with those satellites and with that technology. So the fact that there isn't necessarily human agency now does not necessarily mean that there won't be in the future. And I think there's still sort of this potential of a lot of those pieces of technology to, in the future, interact again with humans.
And potential is such a great way to describe. So one of the most commonly used definitions of space junk is something that does not work currently and has no function in the foreseeable future. So it's time dependent. And there's the concept, a spacecraft will be launched with a mission and a mission life and an end of life. And that end of life could come about by accident, or it could come about, after 5 years, then all of the engineers working on that spacecraft will be reassigned to other teams. So it isn't that it doesn't work. It isn't that it's dead. It's that the mission was finished and now those people are working on something else. And then that's when, the code gets lost, or the particular piece of equipment that was used for communication gets stuck in a corner in a shed somewhere, And you need that knowledge of all those engineers to actually figure it out again, and it can get lost surprisingly quickly. So there are a number of spacecraft that have the potential to be repurposed and reused, and it's happened with a few of them. So I think, again, this comes back to, you know, cultural definitions of trash and junk and garbage and discard. So those things are not the same. Those are all slightly different things. And a lot of stuff that's currently called space junk and hence is bad. And I'm not saying it isn't bad. I'm saying space junk is a problem, but it's called junk. And so we dismiss it. We stop thinking about it. But a lot of it has potential. It has a future use. And maybe we need to be thinking more creatively about how we could repurpose some of these spacecraft. And it is surprisingly difficult to find out because they need fuel, they need power. It's not good to leave residual fuel in a spacecraft because it can become unstable and blow up and create more space junk. But it needs power to work again. So.
No, I was going to mention, now that you were saying, Alice, something about the technology. I know probably you might say, Ricardo watched too much TV, but
but no, we're not saying that.
No, but for example, there's this episode, Twilight Zone. You know, it's of course sci-fi, when, you know, there was this guy who is sleeping cryogenic or something engineer, and in the future, they woke him up because he is the only one available with knowledge to manage certain technology to communicate with a satellite. But actually, it's not a satellite, it's a spacecraft of government officials, you know, returning to Earth after I don't know how many years of something, you know, they blow up. So, you know, that kind of things give you the idea of like, how can we, and actually there's someone on Twitter that I don't remember his handle, you know, who is always working with old technology like computers, game consoles, and, you know, like bringing to life all those things that actually sometimes we are, you know, like keeping them in the shed, or, you know, like the old computer that we might not be able now. Not that he repurposed, like he brings them up, you know, like how to create, of course, an interface. I don't remember his name. So, well, there's no more questions here, but I wanted to to make some commercials. You know, of course, if you have more comments, I know that we can go on and on.
So much more to talk about. Well, we talked a lot about sort of human objects in space, but I think it's not maybe in this conversation, but it's a good pretext to have a future conversation about also space heritage on Earth, and then sort of what things we think of as valuable that are space related that are on Earth, and we can go back to place names, but also things like space museums, right? And like what kind of objects are in space museums? And then there's a museum in Mexico City that has supposedly one of the original 3 Sputniks. Like it's in a museum in Mexico City. There's a space suit that travels around with the space agency that was used by Chris Hadfield. It's a Russian, there's a Soviet Sokol suit, and there's all these sort of objects, meteorites, which are not human-made objects, but are very much human-valued objects that come from space. And I know that they're very important in Mexico, and I imagine in Australia as well. So much more we could discuss. I know we don't have time to talk about that.
No, but what I was going to say, you know, like it will be tacos, Sputnik, and spacesuit, and the Starlink when Alice visits. Well, actually,
I want it so badly. I'm coming to visit.
Actually, Anne has a picture somewhere that she showed me with this. It was the space or the cosmonaut suit.
It was used by Chris Hadfield. But yes, it's originally a Soviet spacesuit. It's my Twitter picture, so anybody who follows me on Twitter can see me.
Yeah, but there's a story behind that, because it was, well, you know the story. You know how it ended up in Mexico and where it was kept.
Yeah, it was a whole thing about it. It ended up with a sort of with some like local association in the United States, and then they loaned its own loan technically to the Mexican government. And it's called Vladimir because they took it to like teach kids in like Chiapas or somewhere about the joys of space, and they had made some kind of diorama or something with a figure called Ludmilla, and they decided that Ludmilla had fallen in love with the spacesuit, and so they called it Vladimir because it went with. Anyway, it's a long story, but yes. But again, this emotional attachment to objects and this emotional attachment to space and the stories that we make up about space, I think, are important when we think about heritage as well.
Yes, there's a lot of stories, and I would love to have both of you again in this space or in another space, and talk about more topics. But in the meantime, I know that we promised to keep it short, but I want to make some commercials. First, invite everyone who is seeing us or viewing us and listening to us. Is give yourself a chance to read, for example, Alice's book, and I have, here in the Google, it's a great cover, Dr. Space Junk versus the Universe. It's great. I'm going to share the...
Thank you for the plug. I appreciate it.
I have it somewhere, but I don't know where it is. It's around here somewhere.
No, but let me share where are you? Oh, here it is. So everyone can see here. It's a great cover. There she is. Grabbing... and the Sputnik, I think it's a great. No, so those interesting, please also follow her on Twitter. And in the case of Anne, although she recently wrote a piece for a magazine, but I don't recall where she has it, I'm going to show everyone a little art that Anne, I don't know.
Did not create.
Well, she doesn't, but she collects and uses it a lot for her own research. And this is the bulletin of the association. We are both, we have been there. And Anne was in charge of editing and organizing this number for everyone. So it's free for everyone. You can download it. It's about anthropology and ethnography in 21st century Mexico. And this is original art. That it was made for a contest here in Mexico, and you see it is quite a thing, completely different.
It's great.
And Anne has an article here about, I just forgot, but it is about...
The anthropology of space. It's why there should be an anthropology of space, basically.
Exactly. But with special reference to Mexico, if I'm not wrong. So... those are great commercials because both are great readings, so it can be, for those rainy days, it's great to have both of your research that I actually appreciate a lot, because although I don't do research about it, everyone knows that I'm involved in history of anthropology or indigenous economies of 18th century. So I'm all over the place sometimes. But anyway, so now it's time of the commercials. So the U.S. Congress call for papers is open. It will close on June 30. So we have 28 days to present your paper. All the thematic panels are on the webpage, and it's very easy to apply. Just write your abstract, your title, and yes, most of the things are about. Some of the things are about heritage. Yes. Some other things about archives, but there are some other topics that are related, of course, of anthropology, because this is a congress that has a title, heritages, but actually it is an anthropology congress. So this is part of the pre-activities, and of course, nothing better than having two specialists about outer space. That it's a topic that we, or very few people know about it, but there's a lot of research, and I know that it will engage everyone in, at least in reading or learning what it is, or to rethink. I don't know if the word is rethink, about what we understand about heritage, especially outer space. And Alice gave me a lot of ideas, and actually, but this is personal comment, about the rockets that you mentioned, when kids, and I'm going to start looking, closer to certain places in Mexico, but because there should have been some of those, you can climb, see the perspective. So
I'm keen to learn of your results from this research, Ricardo.
No, you can join us when you come visit. We're going
to just do an entire tour for you. Don't worry.
We can do a multi-situated ethnography visit, tour, gastronomic also.
There's a house in the Colonia Roma that was built by our Mexican architect who was a consultant for NASA. And he built it, he called it Cali Cosmica. And it's a sort of geodesic dome house that's in danger of being destroyed, speaking of patrimony. He built it that way because he felt like it was important to use space technology in Mexican architecture because it would be a way to avoid using concrete in a seismic zone. So it's on the.
That's sensational.
You see more things to have fun. Sorry, I was writing everyone on Twitter and because they're asking about the Congress. Oh, so many things to do, so many places to visit, and so many things to read. But anyway, we have to go. Well, there was a Ron. Thank you for thank you for watching us, and also Laura Lee wants to join. When Alice visit, so she says like. This is literally what she says is, I want in one Alice visit, Museum of the Genoma Mesoamericana on me. Oh, there he goes. I didn't know that there was a museum about it. Well.
Great.
I think, okay, we will see this. Thank you, Andrea Murillo.
Andrea Murillo is my student, well, not my student, it's actually Laura's student who studies UFOs.
So, great.
So yay that she's here.
Well, hello, and looking forward also to read her research. Although, for example, personally, I would love, to someone. Oh no, I need to go through my archive, but because there's. I would love to hear my Central American colleagues say something because sometimes it's the region who is, from my perspective, is forgotten in so many things. But they have a lot of imaginaries and things. For example, UFOs, coming out of the Atitlan Lake and the volcanoes, and there's a lot of things about imagining there. So it is great. So, Melissa Biggs. Oh,
hey, Melissa.
Melissa also wants to join in, so we're gonna need a boss.
Totally invited. My daughter's godmother, Melissa Biggs.
Oh, perfect. Well, I want to thank Alice. I want to thank Anne, and I would like to thank everyone who has been watching us. This is, of course, being recorded. It's live broadcast, but if those who wants to visit again, it's on YouTube, it's on Facebook, it's on Twitter, like different pages. So there's technically an archive and and from this conversation, there's a lot of ideas, to start new projects or to learn the things that have already been done. So I want to thank you both. And if you will have some closing remarks, please jump in.
I just want to say, what a wonderful opportunity to have this conversation, and I'm so happy to have met you, Anne and Ricardo, virtually, and we could go on. There's so much more to say, but I really think this kind of joining our kind of Australian and Mexican perceptions of space is actually a really important kind of dialogue to have, stepping outside of the normal space power structures. So I'm just so happy and delighted to have been part of this. Thank you for having me.
Same goes for me. Thank you so much to both of you, Ricardo, for the idea, and Alice for agreeing to join us. It's an absolute pleasure. I'm a total fangirl, so it's such a pleasure for me. And yeah, I really hope that it's the first in a series of conversations and things that we can do. Because I agree, I really think that looking at space, because humanity is going to be in space, and it's going to be more and more and more in space. And I think we need to sort of have alternative views outside the sort of, like you say, the sort of traditional centers of space power, and what that could look like and what that should look like. So thank you, and I'm thrilled, and I hope that we get to keep talking about this.
And we will.
Wait till I come to Mexico, then it's all going to happen.
Definitely, yay.
Very soon, Alice, very soon. And you know that, the advantage is that, Anne is just some meters above where I'm sitting right now.
Oh, yes, Ricardo, you are going to be in the center of all of these plans.
So thank you very much, both. We're going to cut here, and we're going to stay here a little longer, but, like to talk gossip. Plan Alice trip. So thank you everyone who is following. I already put on the chat or in the chat. Well, anyway, the information about the is not Mexican, is the International UIS Congress. So please join in. There's still time for present your papers, and there's going to be a lot of things. There's going to be movies. There's going to be book presentations. There's going to be panels. There's going to be roundtables, thematic panels, and of course, there's going to be like the institutions, associations, meetings, World Council of Anthropological Associations, the UIAES, and God knows who else is joining. But it's going to be a great event, and unfortunately, it's not going to be in Mexico. But Mexico, in this case, Yucatan, it was going to be the place where we were going to have, the Congress, tacos, and a little tourism. But, everyone is welcome to join online. Well, have a great evening. I want to thank again Alice Gorman and Johnson. And hopefully, for those who are watching, we're still going on with our pre-Congress conversation. So please just stay tuned to see what we're going to schedule for the next weeks. So it's going to be different topics, but all of them interests with colleagues from all over the world. Thank you and have a great evening and great morning.